Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's session of What Your Child Should Know About African American History. My name is Carolyn Nelson Godert, and I'm the Florida PTA president. We're very happy to have you join us for this educational series. This is the third of four parts that has been curated by Dr. Lothar and her team to bring to you a, a filler for the gap in education that our children here in Florida will be experiencing because of the withdrawal of the AP African American course. That's what spurred us to come forward with this, because we know that parents need the education so that they can pass that along to their children. Our series thus far, especially session one, has provided resources for parents to look into following the sessions so that they can have additional information to share with their children and community members and others. Because if not us teaching our children, then who here in the state of Florida? So tonight we have some distinguished guests, which Dr. Lothar will introduce to you. But again, thank you for joining us. Lean in, learn a lot, and please share the information that you gather. The recording will be posted on the Florida PTA website under our training label. And we've asked you to ask others to make sure that they reach into that, look at all of the series information, and spread the word. Thanks again. Nancy?
Thank you, Carolyn. And I am very much looking forward to tonight's presentation. We have three spectacular speakers, and I am delighted to be able to introduce them. First of all, leading off, our principal speaker is Professor Paul Ortiz. And in the words of John Sensbach, chair of the Department of History at the University of Florida, quote, Paul Ortiz is a historian who is not content to simply tell us what we already know. He is a historian who challenges us to think differently about the past and to consider the ways in which our understanding of history shapes our present and future. End quote. Professor Ortiz, who earned his doctorate in history at Duke, has distinguished himself on numerous fronts. He's a third-generation military veteran, serving as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division and the 7th Special Forces Group in Central America, where he received the U.S. Armed Forces Humanitarian Services Medal. He is the author of numerous groundbreaking publications focusing on the experiences of people of color, including the Black freedom struggle in Florida. His book awards include the Lillian Smith Book Prize, the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Book Prize, and a Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award. Professor Ortiz has served as the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida, an initiative to engage students in the research and recounting of oral history, including that of descendants of the Underground Railway. Last, but certainly not least, he is a gifted teacher who has been honored as Teacher of the Year at the University of Florida and who assisted the National Endowment for the Humanities in developing a web interface and curriculum modules for K-12 educators. Professor Ortiz is currently on sabbatical from UF prior to joining Cornell University this fall as a professor of labor history. And before he stocks up on parkas and gloves in preparation for the winters in Ithaca, he has graciously agreed to share his insights with us on the topic of African Americans in Florida. Professor Ortiz.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Caroline, for that kind introduction. And I feel very honored to be able to speak before the Florida PTA this evening, and such a distinguished group of guests and people who are really engaged with African American history. And it's that civic engagement, it's that movement activism, I think that is helping us turn the tide and really get the kind of knowledge and the kind of content, curriculum content, type of insights, the way of critical thinking that good history encourages among younger people. It's going to take all of us working together. And to me, this is one of the great lessons of US history. I'm actually working to give you a sneak preview of the book I'm working on now. It's called A Social Movement History of the United States. And it essentially argues that insofar as we have made any kind of progress, whether in terms of women's rights, civil rights, human rights, the right to live in peace, both domestically and abroad, insofar as we have achieved anything, it's really been through struggle, through movements. And the laws are one thing, laws are very important. But as we know, those of us who do African American history, particularly in states like Florida, Mississippi, and others, even Brown v. Board of Education would have been literally a dead letter without the activism of generations of African American parents, of teachers, of the NAACP. And so that's kind of a sneak preview of my work. And to give you a sense of why I really just delved head over heels into African American history, Nancy mentioned up top my military experience, but going overseas, being in Central America in the mid-1980s in Special Forces was a big wake-up call for me. And the wake-up call was, number one, there were people in Latin America and the Caribbean who were telling me the history of my country, what I thought was the history of my country, but they were giving me a much different perspective than I had learned growing up, and certainly that the state had taught me. When I say the state, I mean really the state, the federal government. And having the opportunity, those of us who've traveled or who read and have been able to leave the country either physically or imaginatively through listening to music, through literature, you realize that the way that your nation is looked at from outside is very different sometimes than the way it's looked at inside. And so when I returned to the US in 1987 from Central America, I determined to try to figure out things for myself. And one of the first things was, why was the U.S. in Central America? I thought I knew when I left for there, but I really realized once I got there, talking to the descendants of people who had built the Panama Canal, ordinary Venezuelans outside of Caracas, and some of the worst poverty I'd ever seen in my entire life, even worse in Eastern Washington than farm labor camps. And coming home, so-called, in 87, I really determined to try to learn the history of this country in a way that I hadn't learned it before. And really, African American history was the thing that really excited me the most in terms of being able to tell a much more candid, a much more honest, a much more small d democratic story. And the icing on the cake was the fact that I learned once I matriculated to college that African American history was something that students and parents and communities really had to fight for, first of all, to get into colleges and to universities, period, to get Black studies programs, also allied programs in women's studies, third world studies, gender studies. None of these were things that were granted by our existing institutions, certainly not the University of Florida. And Professor Gordon, who's on the line right now, and I co-edited a book on 50 years of African American studies at the University of Florida. And the story of African American studies, as most of us know tonight, is a story of an academic discipline, yes, a rigorous discipline, a discipline that teaches critical thinking, writing, research, a discipline that is second to none in terms of the success rate of our graduates, both on an undergraduate and a graduate level. However, at its inception, and if it is to continue, again, it's the community grassroots base of African American studies that allows it to come into existence in the 60s and then to thrive. It's not something that comes from the top down. It's something that comes from a demand of the communities that sustain our institutions, that we should study Black people. We should study working class people. We should study women. We should study Latinx people. We should study immigrant workers, and understand that labor, to borrow an old maxim, is really the source of all wealth. I'm not going to go too far into liberal theory tonight, I promise, but one of the aspects of liberal theory, if you go back to John Locke, is that without labor, there is no liberal society. You just have just a bunch of land, and would just sit there. From a Lockean perspective, you have to have the labor. Well, who does? African American, who are the key to understanding the development and the accrual of wealth in the society. I first came to Florida in 1994, the summer of 94. Nancy mentioned I was a graduate student at Duke. I was working on a publicly funded oral history project called Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. It was just an incredible odyssey. We were doing oral histories with African American elders in the early 1990s about their experiences growing up in American apartheid. And I did interviews in the Mississippi Delta, in the Arkansas Delta, in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Eastern North Carolina. I arrived in Florida for the first time in my life in the summer of 1994, literally weeks after the Rosewood reparations hearings had been held in Tallahassee. And the environment in Florida was electric. Everyone wanted to talk about history. It was a rare, incredible moment to be a student of history, because everyone had an opinion on the remarkable testimony, the heroic testimony of the survivors and their descendants of the Rosewood Massacre. Courage to get up before a often hostile state legislature, and that they had allies, some from academia, but mainly families and community that supported them to give that testimony, really turned the and it really was a wake-up call, I think, for people in Florida. When I began my book, my first book, Emancipation Betrayed, which is a story of African American history in Florida, the common sense, even academic idea of race relations in Florida was that, oh, Florida was not as bad as Mississippi. It wasn't as bad as Georgia. The race relations were relatively moderate. And the further south you went, the more progressive it got. Well, I found out through oral history, all of that was a lie. It was ridiculous. It was embarrassing even, because when you began to interview African Americans from Miami, from Gainesville, from Pensacola, from Jacksonville, from Gaston County, from Bradenton, you began to understand there was more commonalities across the state, and you began to understand some basic hard facts, one of which was Florida had the highest per capita lynching rate consistently throughout the entire Jim Crow era. Florida, if you read Black newspapers, really from the antebellum period to the 1960s, Florida had a reputation of being the toughest state in the South, way tougher than Mississippi, way tougher than Georgia. In fact, there's a common phrase, if you read the Pittsburgh Courier, when there would be outbreaks of anti-Black violence in Chicago or Detroit, 1944, the Chicago East St. Louis race riot, 1917, the Black writers would say, this is either as bad as Florida, or it is worse than Florida. And that's how Florida was seen in the African diaspora, not just in this country, by the way, but really throughout the Americas. So what I want to do is show you some slides. I'm a history professor. I'll apologize. You know I have to have some PowerPoint slides. But I promise you they're going to be, I'm going to try to make them as interesting as I possibly can, because what I'm going to share are some, what I think are just basic, let me make sure I have the, and make sure I'm sharing the slide show here. Okay, is that showing up as, are y'all seeing that?
Yes, we see the PowerPoint presentation, but in like there you go. Now it's in the presenter view.
Okay. So that's the presenter view? Or, okay, so that's the present, okay, perfect. So what I want to start with is a theme that is very important, I think, especially in the context of what we're dealing with now in Florida and many states across the union. And I want to say this isn't the challenges we face in African American history aren't just in Florida. I do work with school districts all across the country. Many of those districts, even those outside of the South, are currently under siege, frankly. You may have heard some of you, the testimony that was given out in Montgomery County, Maryland, by the leaders of the school system there. Montgomery County is one of the school districts I've worked with frequently. It's a very progressive school district. Its middle school children have the option of learning women's history. They have the option of learning Asian American history, Black history. And because of that, they're under siege, frankly. There are a lot of people that don't want our younger people learning these types of ethnic histories, these types of unique, distinctive histories. They want a kind of a very watered down version of history. Montgomery County is a leader in giving its middle school students and high school students rigorous ways of looking at history, and therefore it's under attack. But closer to home, in Alachua County, this was a great moment in the history of our county. As you know, we are home to Santa Fe College, to the University of Florida, to a lot of really great institutions. But the Black Lives Matter movement was a wake-up call for us in 2020. And one of the first things our students did was they began, and when I say our students, I mean high school students, university students, college students, began passing around a petition demanding that the elementary school closest to the University of Florida be renamed, or at least change the name away from General J.J. Finley, a Confederate general who wasn't even from Gainesville. So the first question was, how does this man get his name on an elementary school? So I got a call late one evening from the president of the Alachua County NAACP, and she announced that I was now the official historian of the Alachua County NAACP. And my first task was to learn about this character, individual J.J. Finley. And so I learned about him, and I was asked to make an assessment of whether or not a public building should be named after him in Gainesville. And my research report, basically, I said, no way. I don't understand how the school was named after him in the first place from 1930 to present, but it should change. But as many of us tonight know, protest is one thing, but the real work starts often when we put our picket signs away, right? When we leave, when the legislative session finishes. And so I was asked to serve on the task force by the school district to come up with a different person. Okay, so you don't like J.J. Finley, who would you want to replace J.J. Finley with? And I'm not going to read the citation, but to me, this is one of the great experiences of my entire life as a historian, because we were able to successfully name the elementary school that had informally been named by a Confederate general who wasn't even from our county, for someone who was from our county, for someone who actually served our nation, Carolyn Beatrice Parker, and incredibly honorably in the Manhattan Project, who died of leukemia, as most of her colleagues died of leukemia working on the Manhattan Project and that part that she worked on. And it was just really a great experience. And the lesson for me, again, is the importance of civic engagement. So the students kind of got us moving. A lot of people had talked about this school. They didn't like it. They didn't like the name of the school. But it took the students, it took the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then citizen action, and then research, and then going to a lot of meetings, and then finding and learning about Carolyn Beatrice Parker was a great experience for me as a historian. I really didn't know about her before this whole process. And for our troubles, several of us were named to the school advisory council for the newly renamed Carolyn Beatrice Parker Elementary. And one of the great things about this is that A lot of my colleagues and people who work on campus send their children to Parker Elementary. And they tell me these stories that I never would have imagined. And they'll say, my daughter is in second grade. And she said, Mom or Dad, I just found out about who our school's named after. It's named after a woman scientist. I may want to grow up to become a scientist. What is a scientist? And it's really cool. And it's having incredible benefits and advantages I never thought of in terms of renaming it. It was more than just renaming the school. It was what happened afterwards. If I had to pick a phrase for African American history in Florida, I would draw from that old biblical story, and then of course James Weldon Johnson and Rosamond Johnson picked the phrase "Stony the road we trod" for a key sequence in what becomes known as the Negro National Anthem, "Lift every voice and sing." Because from the very beginning, African Americans have had a struggle in Florida. And often the struggle, sometimes it's local, often it's national. It's almost always international, by the way. And especially the first few centuries of African American life, and we'll hear more about this a bit later this evening. But basically, Black agency, African American insurgencies for freedom often take place not just against the state and not just against Florida, but really against the United States. That is, for generations, African Americans took up arms to try to prevent the United States from consolidating and spreading slavery into the southeastern quadrant while the country was marching across with slavery to the west. And so this makes African American agency really integral to the story. What African Americans and indigenous people are fighting against, of course, is a system of slavery that is so brutal it's hard to express through words. And so oftentimes we do it through murals. And in my courses on African American history, I draw heavily from Latin America and from the Caribbean, because in many national cultures, Mexico, for example, where these two amazing murals come from, there's a long understanding that to teach effectively, we have to pull out all the stops, right? Some people don't like books. A lot of my students at UF don't like to read, but they'll listen to music. They'll look at a painting. They'll look at something that's multimedia. And the genius of Mexican culture was to remind us that the most intense, complex aspects of our history can be depicted visually. And they shouldn't just be in schools or universities or libraries or museums. They should be out of doors. They should be where you just run into them. And those traditions of muralism in Mexico passed to the United States during the WPA project. The African American freedom struggle in Florida is a major part of the first, or all three of the so-called Seminole Wars in the American Southeast. These, by the way, are the most expensive wars in American history, really until the US Civil War. And they're wars that essentially, we talk sometimes about the Seminoles being defeated, but in many ways, because we've been able to interview their descendants through the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and other programs, we realized that people essentially evacuated, in the 1820s and the 1840s. But they considered the fact that they never really were defeated by the United States of America, but they were fighting, essentially holding actions to try to keep slavery from pushing more down into the peninsula. It makes Florida's history very unique. And this is a great opportunity. We'll hear from archaeology. There's a great, wonderful opportunity for a lot of local history work to be done about what makes Florida different in terms of African American history. Florida is a way station, always was a way station, for the Underground Railroad south into the Bahamas, over to Mexico, into the peninsula, in maroon communities that are just now really being excavated, and some of the largest maroon communities actually in the Americas. What makes Florida unique? What makes it distinct? Great research questions that you can have middle school kids, you can have grade school kids working on. It doesn't have to be university professors. Florida is always at the center of African history in the Americas. And you see it here with Frederick Douglass and his quote, I won't read this quote, but essentially he's talking here about how basically there's a civil war coming, and the Civil War is coming to the United States because the U.S. is pushing slavery into Florida. It's attacking Native American nations out west. It's annexing Texas. It's doing all of this to build a thriving capitalist slavery system at the same time that other nations have abolished slavery. Remember, the Haitian Revolution ends triumphantly in 1804. Mexico abolishes slavery during the process of its War of Independence. The French are moving towards emancipation. Even the old British Empire is moving towards emancipation. At the same time, the U.S. is moving in the opposite direction. The U.S. is moving to strengthen, to buttress slavery. And Frederick Douglass gives an amazing, powerful talk. By the way, this is just one sentence of this talk, and it's a much longer sentence, where he's saying, this is why we have a Civil War, y'all, basically because you decided that you wanted to, you couldn't give up the profits of slavery, and you wanted to appease the South. This is the price we pay now. Our nation is in the midst of one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. The individuals that we can learn from in African-American history, and I think that are inspirational to think about, I mentioned Carolyn Beatrice Parker, a person who I learned about thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement and then in my research, and Howard Thurman is one of those who's always been pretty well known, but because of the style of his writing, a lot of folks have been kind of, they don't know him as well. He was a behind the scenes person during the civil rights movement, but he's a Floridian through and through. He becomes a spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King Jr., to James Lawson. He was actually a contemporary of Dr. King's father. They were very close. But I want to read something from my first book, Emancipation Betrayed, about Howard Thurman. You know, where did he get his incredible, powerful Christian theology of liberation? Where did it come from? He was known as one of the most learned Christian theologians of the 20th century, but it all comes back to Florida. And I'll read this passage from Emancipation Betrayed. One day early in the 20th century, an elderly woman is sharing a part of her life story with her grandson on the family's front porch. Reared in Daytona, the child has spent much of his life with this venerated midwife, reading passages of the Bible to her because she is illiterate. There is one part of the sacred text, however, that the young boy's grandmother, a descendant of African slaves and Seminole Indians, refuses to let him read aloud in her presence. The Pauline epistles, with their injunction for slaves to obey their masters. By way of explanation, Nancy Ambrose recounts her life as a slave in Madison County, Florida, and bristles with anger when she recalls, quote, "Old man McGee was so mean that he would not let a Negro minister preach to his slaves. Instead, McGee directed a white pastor to teach, quote, it was God's will that we were slaves, and how if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible." From a seat on his grandmother's front porch, the young boy, Howard Thurman, who will grow up to become one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, listens, troubled by the ways that Christianity has been used to bolster tyranny. And the result of this is a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. And this comes out of what Thurman learned from his grandmother, a former enslaved African-American woman in Madison County, and his discussions with Mahatma Gandhi in India. Gandhi was blunt with Thurman when they met in the 30s. This is a very famous meeting. This highlights the international dimensions of African-American history. See, African-American history in Florida is almost always international. It's not just about, it's local, yes, it's distinctive in a region, but it's also national and always, almost always international. So this young Christian theologian ends up in India during the Great Depression, and he's debating with Mahatma Gandhi, who's in the middle of this great freedom struggle, anti-colonial struggle against the British. And Gandhi looks at Thurman and he says, Reverend Thurman, I don't understand it. I don't get it. How can your people be Christians? The Christians enslaved you. We've rejected Christianity in India. Why do your people embrace it? And Thurman explained to Mahatma Gandhi that the Christianity that African Americans practiced was not the Christianity of their slave masters, that they had turned it upside down back to what Thurman believed was really the origins of Christianity as a religion of the oppressed, not a religion of the successful, not a religion of the rich and wealthy, or the colonialist or the slave master, but a religion for, as Thurman called, people who lived their entire lives with their backs against the wall. And this is why Thurman becomes an internationally renowned Christian theologian of the 20th century. But again, it all starts in Florida. Florida, as I mentioned, is a bitter, terrible place in terms of anti-Black violence, in terms of the number of pogroms. Florida is unique in the sense that most of the sundown towns, and these are towns where African Americans or Mexican Americans or Asian Americans were driven away from and not allowed to return to when the sun set, right? That's why they're called sundown towns. But most of those sundown towns are in the Midwest or out west. Very few of them are in the South, except for Florida. Florida has a lot of these sundown towns, especially in the south of the state and down deeper into the peninsula. So it's always been a struggle for African Americans. But you have individuals like Stetson Kennedy. He's another person I want us to lift up. School kids should be reading Stetson Kennedy's works. He's the first person, again from Florida. He grew up in a Klan family, a white man who helped create a strip, a comic strip, where Superman was battling the Ku Klux Klan. This was the first, and it was a comic strip, and it was a radio show too. And it's the first time that we know in American history that the Ku Klux Klan was actually depicted on a popular cultural stage as an enemy of freedom, as an enemy of democracy. Up until that time, the Klan had been depicted very differently. If you remember D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, where the Klan is depicted as heroic saviors of white womanhood, et cetera, et cetera. But people like Stetson Kennedy, who grew up in the Klan, knew that the Klan was not like that. The Klan was really a bad group of individuals, and so he was trying to get that point of view out there. Mary McLeod Bethune is another person who we should all know about. I mean, I think if there is an AP course, if there's a civics exam, Mary McLeod Bethune should be right there, number one. I mean, I had the incredible privilege to be in Washington, D.C. when Dr. Bethune's statue was unveiled in the National Rotunda. And it was such a wonderful, beautiful experience to talk to, especially children around the Rotunda, about Dr. Bethune, who she was, what she tried to do, her views of education, her views of social policy. Again, a person who's important in Florida, yes, but she uses, like Howard Thurman, she uses Florida to create an international stage. This educator, Dr. Bethune, is formative in the early ideas of the creation of the idea of human rights at the United Nations. And she uses her experience, her 4-decade-long experience fighting for justice in Florida, to articulate these ideas of international universal human rights. And she's a force to be reckoned with in the early United Nations. But the second passage I want to read for you from Emancipation Betrayed is a passage that comes from a section of the book that talks about the rising of African Americans after World War I, demanding the right to vote, and the role that Dr. Bethune plays in that struggle. The State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs continued its support for the Florida movement by encouraging African American women to form autonomous Republican clubs. Female activists in Fort Pierce created their own organization and filled all of its leadership positions with women. Another important theme of African American history that we can use oral history, we can get children out there doing interviews. What's the role that Black women have played in politics and democracy enhancement and civic engagement over the decades. Mary McLeod Bethune was president of the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. During the war, Mrs. Bethune had actively promoted a vision of expansive democracy, honoring the elders while celebrating the contributions of African American women, men, and children alike to the war effort. Bethune brought this egalitarian perspective to the voter registration campaign. She spoke about the need for a, quote, reconstruction movement after the war. And she based her idea on citizenship, on equal citizenship in 1920, with the fact that African Americans had fought in every single war in the nation's history going back to the American Revolution. And she based her ideas on equality. And this is interesting that it's Black women in Florida, in South Carolina, in Washington, D.C., in New York, who even before 100,000 African American men embark for France to fight in World War I, it's African American women leaders like Dr. Bethune who are saying, this is it. We have fought for this country over and over and over again. And this time, when it ends, we're going to get equal citizenship because our young men are risking their lives abroad, and at home, we're putting our communities we're impoverishing our communities by literally donating blankets to the Red Cross to go with the young men overseas, because the US in World War I didn't have a infrastructure to properly outfit a modern army. It did not exist yet. It would have to be created for World War II. And so the average citizen was called upon, thrift stamp savings drives. Some of your great-great-grandparents have told you about those, right? And so Black communities participated heavily in supporting their young men abroad, but again, wanting something out of that. And Bethune saying, look, Florida is a place, and this gets us back to Matthew Louis. Matthew Louis is a very important person in Florida history. He is the first person we know who passes the bar exam, first African-American who passes the bar exam. I'm not going to read the slide here, but you can see all of the different movements that he was a part of. But at the base of his career, and he originally was from Baltimore, at the base, what he used everywhere he went, and when you talk to Black Floridians, when you talk to white people, he would say, Black people have nothing to prove. We have earned our citizenship. We fought in one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. And this just gives a little overview of his incredibly distinguished war record. And multiply this by, by several hundred, by thousands, and you get a sense for what African Americans sacrificed during the American Civil War to save the Union, and how people like Matthew Louis used that war service to enhance the idea of Black citizenship. He was literally almost killed in battle. I don't have time to go into how he was wounded, but he was so severely wounded that when he had to pass the colors on to the next young Black NCO, that NCO won the Medal of Honor. And in his citation, it said that he took the colors from a man who was mortally wounded. Well, that man who was mortally wounded was Matthew Louis, except for he survived his wounds. That is, he was so severely wounded that when the shot took him down, his body was full of shot, that he somehow convalesced and survived and made it back, made it to Florida and became a mayor of Noonanville, became a postmaster, became a state legislator, became captain of the local state militia during Reconstruction, defended our local Black high school from attacks several times, and was also the founder of the national, one of the co-founders of the African or the Black National Media Organization. But just something for, I'm beginning to kind of wrap up here. And Nancy, I should wrap up by, I have about 5 or 10 minutes left, Carolyn and Nancy. I want to make sure I'm not.
Yes, that would be good.
Okay. I want to make sure I'm not going too far. But moving towards a wrap up, I want to kind of get back to this idea of citizenship and democracy, because I think as educators, especially in this day and age, if we're doing anything, it's to really lift up these ideas of, of self-emancipation. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be a democracy? What does it mean for local people to run their own lives and to be able to work with each other to keep civil society sustained, right? And the Civil War and the African American part in the Civil War, but African American history writ large, I believe, to me, it's many different things. But in a K through 12 basis, many school districts that I work with, it is taught as a civics lesson, frankly. It is taught as a way to think about ordinary people who do things democratically at a time when the society they live in is not only not democratic, it's anti-democratic, right? It's totalitarian. It's a one-party state like Florida was for most of its history prior to the 1960s. So how do you create democratic ways of interacting with each other, of enhancing your dignity while I enhance my dignity in a society that is based on taking our dignity away from us? That's the promise, I think, of African American history. This slide highlights what I think is the most remarkable friendship in all of American history. The friendship between Frederick Douglass, who we saw earlier, and President Abraham Lincoln. The two became quite close, as close as they could during a bloody Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln, what he says here is very important, because he says this in the middle of a very bitter and contested presidential election in which it's not clear he's going to be able to defeat General McClellan for the presidency. But essentially, Lincoln is getting a lot of flack from people who are saying, President Lincoln, let the South go. And Lincoln's response is, are you crazy? Basically, it's Black people who are saving this republic. We're not going to give up the fight. We're not going to quit now. And there's a whole remarkable sequence of things. During Reconstruction, I've argued in African American Latinx history in the United States that African Americans were far from satisfied when emancipation came in 1865. The first thing that organizations, that churches, labor unions, civic organizations said was, what about Cuba? What about Brazil? What about Russia? These are not free places. What kind of people would we be if we celebrated our own freedom, which we're not even sure we have yet? We're not sure how emancipation is going to play out. What kind of people would we be if we turned our back on the unfree, on the people in bondage in other parts of the world? And so African American communities in Florida, and Josiah T. Walls here is a great figure for students to study. Josiah T. Walls is responding and gives an incredible speech in the floor of the U.S. Congress on behalf of the Cuban liberation struggle against the Spanish Empire in 1874. And there's a very large population, by the way, of Afro-Cubans, of people we call Latinx people now, in Gainesville at the time. Gainesville had a big tobacco factory. And again, this demonstrates the international elements of Black history, the intersectionality, the connections between Black and Brown people. It's always about the international story. And it's also a labor history as well. And Carolyn and Nancy, I'll give you these slides so you'll have them, because I'm just kind of doing a force march through the last few of them. James Weldon Johnson is another individual. The study of the NAACP, I think, is a great study of civic engagement in the state of Florida. To be an NAACP member in 1916, by the way, you could not advertise meetings, because if you advertise meetings, you could be shot, you could be killed, you could be blacklisted. And so how did Black people create these vibrant, in many cases, working class NAACP chapters all across the state of Florida? It's a great research question that I've worked with kids on. And then just to conclude, the state of Florida, because of people like you, right, because of communities, there are requirements now in our educational laws, if you will, that these things should be taught. But I know, as a member of the Florida Historical Society, I know as a frequent contributor to the Florida Humanities, that they're not taught. right? Not because school districts are bad, but because I failed at my job at the University of Florida. Because as one principal told me recently, well, Paul, if you had taught our teachers about the Ocoee Massacre at the University of Florida, you wouldn't have to come back around and do a special workshop with them now, would you? If you had done your job right. I thought it was a little harsh, but I'll take the criticism. Why aren't every one of our universities and colleges in Florida teaching this history to make sure that it begins to percolate? Okay. High school teachers, middle school teachers can only do so much. But Ocoee, again, is just a remarkable story to me. It's a story of people who risked their lives to vote. Think about that. This is not South Africa. This is not Argentina. This is not the Soviet Union. This is the United States of America, where tens of thousands of people are literally risking their lives to pay their poll taxes, to register to vote. And an incredible civics lesson, I think, to learn. So I'll just kind of wrap up there. I'll conclude where we always should conclude, I think, in Florida, on Dr. Bethune. And again, I encourage you, if you haven't went to the National Rotunda yet, go there. Just to be in the presence of the statue is a very powerful experience. I can talk during Q&A about some of the resources that we have. It's a very rich array of resources that we have now. And I've been just excited to play a small part in that. But I'll stop to share now and cede the floor. Thank you for being such a patient audience.
Thank you for your presentation. That was fascinating from beginning to end, and you called to mind a conversation I had many decades ago with a fellow student during my undergraduate days who was talking about Mary McLeod Bethune, and I said, "Who?" And my fellow students said, "You don't know about her? You don't know about anything." So it's been a history that you've exposed to us that I hope will be shared by all of those listening. And we are now going to go on to further exploration with our second speaker, who is Mr. Roberto Fernandez, and he wears many hats. Also former military, a former civil affairs specialist with the U.S. Army. He's a history teacher with 20 years of experience, and he's been recognized as a Florida Social Studies Teacher of the Year. At the same time, he serves as, wearing another hat, historian in residence at History Fort Lauderdale, and also as an adjunct lecturer in history at Florida International University. A native Floridian who received his master's in African diaspora studies from FIU, Mr. Fernandez has not only made local history his passion, but he's taken pains to communicate that love to his students. Among the project that high schoolers completed under his direction was an initiative to understand, to document, and to preserve the stories of those who experienced Broward County's first efforts to desegregate its public schools. As a specialist in the field, Mr. Fernandez was one of those selected to serve on the African American History Work Group, responsible for recommending new K through 12 standards in African American history. In the firestorm of criticism that followed the release of these standards, he was unique among his colleagues to call in an open letter to Commissioner of Education Manny Diaz Jr., first, for the reconvening of the work group in order to respond to community feedback. And secondly, in a spirit of transparency, for the publication of all work group meeting recordings, minutes, and ancillary materials. In his letter, he proclaimed, and I quote, "As educational leaders, we must demonstrate through our words and actions that Floridians do not hide from history, but instead we embrace its lessons and teach them truthfully to the next generation." End quote. We look forward to the lessons he'll be providing today. Mr. Martinez.
Fernandez, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Roberto Fernandez. In the chat, I have thrown in a link to the open letter that I sent to Commissioner Diaz, and I've also put a link to the African American history standards that were approved in July 2023. And I do want to take a moment of, I guess, just sharing. Dr. Ortiz, I saw you mentioned Stetson Kennedy, and I did want to show another book of his. Is The Klan Unmasked, Stetson Kennedy. And this is actually Professor Kennedy here in this image as well. And this is The Klan Unmasked, and you can get this on Amazon. And then because we talked about Superman, I do have, here's Superman smashing the Ku Klux Klan. So, and this, I did not include the state standard that does allow teachers to discuss the Ku Klux Klan, but there is a high school standard for teachers to be able to teach about the, violence against African Americans by the Ku Klux Klan. So that is something that is currently a state standard, and it's in those standards that I sent you, pages, I want to say like 2 or 3 through 21, cover all of African American history standards that were published in July. I am going to share a presentation with you. I'm going to try to make it a little bit quicker so I could be respectful of everyone's time. And so I do want to say that everything that I'm expressing here is my own opinion and does not reflect the Florida PTA, the Florida Department of Education, or any other group that I am associated with. These are my personal opinions. All right. I do want to share with you some of the norms that I usually operate with when I do presentations. I do encourage participants to speak your truth. I'm not sure if the chat is open, but I do encourage conversation in the chat if it is possible. I do ask for you to stay engaged. I do remind everyone to be prepared for discomfort. Because of the way that the standards are written and the way that things are in the state of Florida, we can expect, and I encourage you to accept the non-closure that we will have tonight. And I do ask everyone to respect the space. So those are kind of the expectations. And the position that I'm coming from is one of love, respect, and just my scholarship as well. And I will be speaking my truth and my experience with you in an effort to be as transparent as possible. All right. So my agenda for this evening is a brief introduction, a bit of a discussion about the original African American history mandate, a little bit about the history work group, and then I'm going to review some of the selected standards that I did, and then a couple of suggestions for parents. All right, so as Nancy shared, I did share an open letter. I did publish an open letter as part of my work in the work group, and that's shared with you, so I'm not going to give you, read you or regurgitate something that you can read for yourself. I do bring up the principles of professional conduct for the education professional in Florida. These are the ethics standards for teachers. And I do want to kind of point out part A, the educator values the worth and dignity of every person, the pursuit of truth, devotion to excellence, acquisition of knowledge, and the nurture of democratic citizenship. Essential to the achievement of these standards are the freedom to learn and to teach and the guarantee of equal opportunity for all. So in spite of all the politics and all of the rhetoric that we're hearing on TV and on the radio and, from powers that be, we are still here to teach the truth. All right. And that's what I'm trying to do, is empower families to know where they could find that information, and encourage everyone who's listening to, let's teach the truth. All right. The African American History Mandate goes all the way back to the early 1990s. And it basically, when I started teaching, this was what I would put on my lesson plans as my justification for teaching anything having to do with African or African American history. And the mandate says the history of African Americans, including the history of African peoples before the political conflicts that led to the development of slavery, the passage to America, the enslavement experience, abolition, and the contributions of African Americans to society. This is mandatory instruction under Florida law. This has been mandatory instruction under Florida law since it was implemented in the 1990s. When I started teaching 20 years ago, this was in effect from the very beginning of my career as a teacher. And this is what I used to teach African and African American history. So it's not something new. It's not something that Governor DeSantis decided to grace us with standards because there was nothing. We had such a wide breadth of opportunity with the mandate. All right, so a little bit about the African American History Standards Work Group. And this is one of those things that I think people need to understand. This was organized, the work group was organized by Florida Department of Education in December 2022. Now, what's not on this timeline is that back in June of 2022, a public announcement was made requesting teachers and community members to submit an application to be part of the work group. And so that was something that was shared far and wide. I actually did not submit an application. A member of the Florida African American History Task Force actually approached me in October and said, "Hey, I need your resume. I want to recommend you for the work group." And so I collaborated with them and I got appointed to the work group. The work group consisted of 13 people. It was teachers, like classroom teachers, district staff, and scholars. The work group met in person 2 different times. So initially, the first meeting that we had was February 2nd and 3rd. And the final meeting in person was April 24th, 25th, and 26th of 2023. These were the only in-person sessions. They were publicly noticed, and we did have members of the Florida Education Association that were present. I remember specifically in February that they were all present. A couple of members from the FEA were there and commented on the work and the rigor that we were working on at that time. In April, we also had some observers as well from the community. In between the February 3rd session and the April 26th session, we met every Monday through Teams meetings to discuss the standards. The majority of the time, all right, so from February 2nd until April 25th, we focused on the high school standards, because the idea was if we know how we're going to end what we're teaching, then we can scaffold it down to the lower grades. So middle school will get something that's derivative of the high school standards, and then elementary will also kind of get some of that. So it is kind of like a shoot, if you will, of learning African American history. The work group, and I got that, on May 1st, 2023, that was the final online meeting of the work group when we reviewed the standards and then said, yep, go ahead and send it. Now, one of the things as we worked, and I will share just my personal experience, I was working on these standards with a mindset of I need to put as much content in there as possible, because I was operating under the impression that at some point, someone in the powers that be above us would withdraw or retract content. Surprisingly, we had a couple of additions. There were some additional people that were thrown into some of the lists that are in the standards. But for the most part, everything that was submitted on May 1st is what is currently in the standards. And I say that truthfully because the 2 controversial standards, I will show them to everybody just in case, were part of that original review. So And then in July 2023 is when the Florida Board of Education approved the African American History Standards. Now in Florida, one of the things that happens with the approval of new standards is you have a 1-year kind of implementation period, which is where school districts have the opportunity to review the standards and develop the curriculum to go into the classroom. And then the following year is when the standards actually go into full effect. So this year is that implementation period. So in August, when students return to school, that is when every teacher should be focused on teaching the African American history standards. The standards were developed in a collaborative effort, and it was really an effort of consensus as we worked to develop the standards. And I will speak about one of the standards in a minute. Right. So this is the cover page for the standards, which I gave you the link for. And so one of the standards that has hit, that was on the media in July, is specifically the part that I'm highlighting to you. It says instruction includes acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans. And really that's the part that hit the news and that was used throughout the state and throughout the country. But I am showing you the full standard. Now, I will tell you, and this is again my truth, this standard was built in part because of my effort to ensure that Rosewood, Ocoee, and Tulsa massacres were included in the curriculum. The teaching of Rosewood, of the incident in Rosewood or the Rosewood massacre, has been part of the Florida history standards, the American history standards, since about 2015. Prior to that, I used to teach Rosewood to my students without having a standard. I just operated under the African American mandate. I said, okay, I'm good. This is still part of that history. But, you know, when the Ocoee legislation passed, in the work group, we're like, oh, well, Ocoee, we're supposed to teach Ocoee. And it says, well, what the law actually said is that Ocoee, you know, the task force will find opportunities for insertion of the Ocoee massacre into curriculum, but it doesn't say it has to be a standard. So then I was like, oh, we're going to fix that. So I wanted to make sure that we included Ocoee. Tulsa and Black Wall Street is one of those other stories that we really need to focus on teaching. So I insisted on Tulsa being there as well. Some of the other riots that you see here were included by some of the other members. Now, the question becomes, why do we have the language perpetrated against and by African Americans? And that is in part because of the Stop Woke Act, which requires us to teach history in a fair manner. So this was the compromise that we ended up coming up with for this particular standard was, all right, if we have to do it, in my opinion, I was like, it's either this or we don't have a standard that specifically allows teachers to teach Ocoee, Rosewood, or Tulsa. You know, so that's part of this process. This one I claim responsibility for as one of the people that was part of writing this particular standard. And as you can see, there's other language in this. We talk about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. And then within the examples that are provided, you have the Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, lynching. We also have the Columbian Exposition of 1893. And I'll come back to the lynching piece, but I did want to just point that out to you. All right. And this is the other one. This is a middle school standard. I was not present. This was on the last day of the in-person meetings in Tallahassee. I was not there for the development of the middle school standards or the elementary school standards because I had to travel home to take care of my kids. So I missed this day. And then when we went to review the standards, I focused on high school and elementary school. And personally, I missed this because I was more focused on trying to get the kids in elementary school to be exposed to other Black figures aside from Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. So, you know, if you want to be mad, this is one of the reasons to be mad at me specifically. But this is the standard where it talks about instruction includes how slaves develop skills, which in some cases could be applied for their personal benefit. And really the major aspect of this is to examine the duties and trades that enslaved people had. In looking and preparing for tonight, I did see the high school standard that I believe was, the inspiration for what this is. And again, I really think that this can be cleaned up to be more sound with what we want to communicate to teachers. But again, this is one of those non-closure things for me too. I can't do anything to fix this now. All right, so one of the things that I do want to point out to everyone is that within the standards, we do have a difference of IE versus actually it's supposed to be EG. And I apologize for the heading there. So IE stands for the Latin id est, or that is, and is to be used to introduce a word or phrase that restates what has been said previously. So usually this is meant to clarify the earlier statement. And I'll show you examples of this within the standard. And then the EG means for example, and basically means in Latin exempli gratia, in which it's a free example. So here's a couple of free examples just for your knowledge, but it is an item or a list of items, but is not, refined or confined just to the examples that are given. So the IE is the one that limits, and then the EG basically is like, here's some examples, but you're not limited to just these. I'm going to show you that in some of the standards right now. So here is a kindergarten standard. And I know that this is a kindergarten standard because we have SS, which means social studies, K, which means kindergarten, AA, African American, and this is strand 1 and then standard 1. So it says recognize African American inventors and explorer, and then IE, that is Lonnie Johnson, Mae Jemison, and George Washington Carver. So in this case, in kindergarten, teachers are required to teach only Lonnie Johnson, George Washington Carver, and Mae Jemison. All right. And then in second grade, we see a similar thing where we have a list of individuals: Aretha Franklin, Charles White, James Earl Jones, and Maya Angelou. So this is again where we see like these are the people you're focusing on. And then moving forward into second grade, we have identify African Americans who demonstrated civic service. In this case, again, a list. But then if you look at second grade standard 2, now we have identify oral traditions and folk tales of African Americans. And then in this case here's a free example: Anasazi the Spider, Tale of the Midnight Goat Thief. Now, as a teacher and as somebody who's been to Ethiopia, I could tell the story of Kaldi and his goat. And Kaldi is a young man in Ethiopian lore that discovered coffee. And so that's one of those oral traditions that can be shared that is not part of the standard. But if I know the story and I want to share it, I'm welcome to do that because this standard allows me to. And I'm within the law and within my ability and rights as a teacher to teach that story of Kaldi. All right, and then moving forward, I'm not going to keep going through all of them. In this fourth grade standard, and fourth grade is where we focus a lot on Florida history. In the Florida history, you see a lot of people that are important to Florida history. Here's Mary McLeod Bethune, who Dr. Ortiz mentioned earlier. We have, of course, Zora Neale Hurston. We have the Florida Highwaymen, the artist that contributed a lot. We have Bessie Coleman. So we have a variety of people, but again, it's EG. All right. So in Broward County, one of the important leaders in Broward County is Dr. Von D. Mizell. And we also have Miss Eula Johnson, two very powerful civil rights leaders, especially in the 60s, who helped integrate the beaches here in Broward County and really fought hard to do a lot of work to advance the rights of African Americans in Broward. We can talk about them in fourth grade because we have the EG flexibility. All right. And I'm just gonna, and then here we have for fifth grade, examine the experiences and contribution of African Americans in early Florida. And, Professor Ortiz mentioned the Negro Fort. And although for 5th grade, it may not be appropriate necessarily, but a teacher does have the right, because we do have the Black Seminoles listed here too. We can talk about Negro Fort. We could talk about the runaway slaves from the southern states who fled through the saltwater underground railroad and stuff like that. We have that opportunity to begin those conversations. We do have Eatonville, the historic home of Zora Neale Hurston, and one of the inspirations of the book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. All right. This is my daughter. I think she was in kindergarten or 1st grade in these pictures. What I did was she came home and said, I want to do a project for Black History Month. And I said, you know what, we're going to do something unique and different. And so I took her to several local sites. And so one of them is the Dr. Von D. Mizell Eula Johnson State Park, which was newly named when she was little. It used to be John U. Lloyd State Park. And so I took her to this site. I told her about Dr. Mizell and about Eula Johnson. I then took her to the site of Provident Hospital in Fort Lauderdale, which was the only hospital that served Black residents in Broward County. And that was only from the late 1930s into the early 1960s, when the hospitals were finally desegregated. And so just an effort to get her to break away from the easy leaders. And so it was one of those things where she turned in her assignment and the teacher's like, wow, I didn't know who these people were. Yes, I won. And parents, this is how we teach our teachers too, by helping our kids and helping our kids learn about local history too. All right. And again, just kind of showing another standard. And again, you have the EGs. So we are not limited to just to these standards. Now, one of the things when we talk about, the middle school standard about the personal benefits of slavery is, well, how do you counteract that? Well, I could tell you that, I don't see any personal benefits of being enslaved, but I'll tell you what, why don't we give you a source to read? So one of the things that I explicitly pushed for was the inclusion of Phyllis Wheatley and her slave narrative, Obluda Equiano, Omar Ibn Said, and Cudjoe Lewis. And then, of course, because it's Florida, I wanted to make sure that people had an opportunity to learn about Anna J. Kingsley. And because that is now a site that people can go visit if they're in that Jacksonville area, they can go see that site of enslavement. There are multiple books written about Anna, and that teachers can use to learn and teach those stories. So how do we kind of show that other story is by showing kids rich primary source material. Here's the book, here's the story. Let's talk about it. Let's read it together. All right. And then again, this is the standard I showed you earlier, but I did highlight lynchings because to me, including lynchings in this standard was extremely important to me and very personal. As Nancy said earlier, one of the things that I have been doing for 10 years now is working at a historic Black cemetery in Fort Lauderdale. And one of the stories that I've been part of telling the story is that of a man named Reuben Stacy. He was lynched in 1935 in Fort Lauderdale. His image was taken. There were many, many pictures of Reuben Stacy and his lynching. His image was taken by the NAACP and basically shared throughout the country in an effort to raise funds for the NAACP to combat against lynching. And I wanted to make sure that teachers had an opportunity to share the stories of lynchings. And I didn't want to say tell Reuben Stacy's story because that's a Broward story, but you can tell the stories of lynchings in your different county and your different school district, and that's one of those things like Dr. Ortiz said, it's like, the lynchings happened. We were the lynching capital of the United States year after year after year. And so we can tell those stories. And so it is in the standard. This is, again, this is the last edition that I did. This is literally the last standard for high school. And as you could see, yes, I put my cemeteries in there because I want students to go to cemeteries. We have so many opportunities to teach students the real history, for students to learn their own history, for students to create their own history by visiting cemeteries, doing the research. So This is an image taken yesterday. Yesterday, I was with Coconut Creek High School students, as you can see in this photograph, and we are at a historic cemetery called West Lawn Cemetery in Dania, Florida. The cemetery was started in 1904. Dania is the oldest incorporated city in Broward County. And this was the first time that a group of students is going to this cemetery to do research on some of the members of the African American and the Black community, because we have many Bahamians and Black Caribbean people that lived in Broward, that died in Broward, and that helped develop our community as it is. And so what we were doing at the cemetery was we were taking a survey. We were basically going out and locating all of the military markers at the cemetery, and we were photographing them. And that's what you're seeing here is the kids are actually on a break. And one of the students, she actually has a clipboard. You can kind of see the clipboard where they're taking notes. And behind that one is the other that has a map of the cemetery. And the one girl has flags in her hands. And so we're going out and we're finding them all. And then we're taking the photographs and we're trying to document the markers. So then the students can do research on these veterans and their military service, and if possible, on their community service. Bozie Waiters is one of the veterans that we found at the cemetery, and he turns out to be one of the first Black elected officials in Dania Beach in Broward County. And so, this is the kind of thing that teachers can do, but this is also the thing that families can do. You can go out and you can do this work. It's not hard. You can visit the cemeteries. So there's opportunity for families there too. All right, so just a couple of quick pointers for parents. I do encourage parents to read the standards and learn the content. There's a lot of really, really good information in the standards. There's a lot of biography that can be learned. There's a lot of events that can be learned. Do your research, visit your local library, find the books, use primary sources as much as possible, and come up with your own conclusions. I could tell you how to think, but I'd rather my students learned how to think for themselves. Why are you coming up to that conclusion? Why do you believe that to be the case? Is there a different perspective that might elucidate this a little bit better? And to that point, if we're teaching about Ocoee, one of my favorite sources, because I did a lesson on Ocoee 3 years ago during the pandemic, I was like finding resources, and we ended up I found every newspaper article from every white newspaper in Florida. And then I found the New York Age, which is a historic Black newspaper. And so they had about a month after the incident, they published an article where one of the survivors of Ocoee actually told their story. And I was like, here is a source from a different point of view. And then a couple of weeks later, I received one of the Library of America volumes of Zora Neale Hurston's anthropological work. And in that volume was her account of the Ocoee massacre when she went into parts of Florida and she interviewed people who survived Ocoee. And so, we have Zora telling a story. We have the New York Age telling us a story. And so now we get those Black perspectives through these primary source materials. I do encourage parents to focus on local history. Find the sites of Black history in your community. They're there, they're important. They tell us a lot. And so focus on that. And then, of course, please, please, please don't forget the trick I told you about the IE and the EG. The EG means it's a free example. So you're not limited to just that or those limited people in that list. Thank you so much. Nancy, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fernandez. And we've learned a lot. I had been through the standards myself. You kind of made them come to life. And that's the benefit of having a great teacher. So we have spoken during this particular session a couple of times about the Negro Fort. We've talked a little bit about the Black Seminoles. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Mr. Colby Williams, who is a master's student at the University of South Florida on the archaeology track, and with a concentration on in cultural resource management, which he abbreviates as CRM. He has over 7 years of CRM experience and is familiar with all phases of archaeological excavation. As an undergrad, he attended an NSF-sponsored field school dedicated to the study of the human impact on the environment in the Anthropocene epoch. Last year, he was selected as the inaugural awardee for USF's Susan K. Ryan Fellowship in support of his thesis research on the Maroon community at Prospect Bluff. Today, he's going to be sharing with us insights about this community that is often left out of the dominant narrative, but remains crucial for understanding early 19th century Florida history. And we are grateful for his presence today because he's finishing up his master's thesis this week. Mr. Williams.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I also have a presentation. It's pretty brief. I'll try and share now. Okay. It's not letting me, it's saying that my system's not open to Zoom. So that's a bit of a technical difficulty. But anyway, my master's thesis is on the Maroon community at Prospect Bluff. It's often termed Negro Fort. The Maroon community of Prospect Bluff formed during the War of 1812. This was a war between Great Britain and the United States following the Revolutionary War. It's sometimes termed the Second War of Independence for the United States. It's infamously known as the war when the British burned down a lot of the public buildings in Washington, D.C., including the White House, Capitol building. But part of that war and part of the strategy that the British employed to fight the United States, whether it was the Revolutionary War, or whether it was the War of 1812, was to offer enslaved Africans throughout the United States their freedom if they would fight on the side of the British. And how this plays into Florida is Florida was part of the Spanish territory, part of the Spanish Empire for almost 200 years. As far back as 1693, the Spanish king put out a proclamation that it granted freedom to enslaved Africans in what was then British colonies if they came down to Spain and fought on the side of the Spanish crown and defended the territory. So what you see is the freedom of enslaved Africans being kind of wagered and used as a military strategy, whether it was the Spanish or the British. So Negro Fort comes about, again, in the War of 1812. The British are trying to open up a front on the Gulf Coast to kind of divert attention away from the main centers of the war, which were around the Great Lakes and around the Chesapeake Bay area. They have this ultimate design to take New Orleans and the Mississippi River. And to do that, they established, at first, just it's a base, but there's not much fortification at a bluff on the Apalachicola River called Prospect Bluff. Then they occupy Pensacola. Again, the ultimate aim is to kind of work across the Gulf and take the main cities along the Gulf, so Pensacola, Mobile, New Orleans, and control the Mississippi River. Ultimately, they're unsuccessful in this, but the main military strategy that they employ is recruiting Native Americans from the Southeast. So you had Seminoles, you had Creek, there was some Choctaw, and also recruiting enslaved Africans, whether it was from Pensacola or St. Augustine or some of the plantations in Georgia, to come down to the Apalachicola River and fight alongside the British. So in my presentation, I have a map. I know you guys can't see, it doesn't help me much, but I have a map that kind of depicts these different areas. So Mobile, Pensacola, St. Augustine, if you can imagine, these were the main centers, urban centers at the time in Florida. And so that left a lot of Central Florida open to like it left a lot of Central Florida open to I guess migration from the southeast. So that's where you get the Seminole from, moving in from areas in Georgia and North Florida. But then the African Americans who are fleeing their enslavement come down into Florida and form these maroon settlements. And so there's a differentiation between petite maroonage, which was more temporary, smaller settlements, smaller amount of people. It could be just one person, maybe running away from a plantation to visit family on another plantation. That was known as petite maroonage. But grand maroonage was more permanent settlements, large amounts of people, with the goal of keeping and maintaining their sovereignty at this settlement. And so Florida became home to numerous maroon settlements that were allied with the Seminole and fought along the side of the Seminole, which was referenced in Dr. Ortiz's presentation earlier. So basically, for my thesis, at the site at Prospect Bluff, there was Hurricane Michael, I think it was in 2018, came through and knocked a lot of trees down, over 100 trees. And there were 3 mitigation projects. I wasn't involved in these projects, but so when the tree fell over, the soil in the root ball would often contain artifacts. And so these artifacts were excavated, and then some of the trees had the base, the cavity from where the tree fell and pulled up the roots. That base was then excavated as well. So for my project, I looked at these artifacts, trying to learn more about the site and about the maroon community there. And I had some photos as well. So there was a lot of European pottery, Native American ceramics, there were musket balls, things associated with a fort. There was gun flints, nails. Due to the way that the artifacts were recovered, it wasn't as strategic. It was kind of at random based on where a tree fell, and then also the disturbance from the tree itself. It's hard to necessarily date or say for certain that these artifacts were used by Maroons or associated more with the Maroon community. Maybe they could have been associated with the British there. There were also Native Americans there. But that also gets into the complexity of maroonage in Florida, because Maroons often used what was available to them because they were fleeing these conditions, often at a moment's notice. And so that's basically what I did. I looked at these artifacts, and I'm still in the process of analyzing them. And I am hoping to get at least a draft done this week of my thesis. So thank you all.
Mr. Williams, are you able to share your presentation with us so that we can put it on our website?
I sent it earlier by email.
Oh, perfect. Thank
Dr.
you.
Dr. Lather. So yeah, sorry about that. I don't know. I guess I had to change. It would have made me exit out and change my settings. So yeah.
Quite all right. Thank you.
So thank you so much. We are close to the end, but I think we do have time for a couple of questions. If there is anyone who is listening and watching who would like to ask any of our panelists a question.
Karen's hand is up, Nancy.
Yeah, Karen.
I'm so sorry, I can't find the right button. Some thoughts regarding the standards. I'm wondering if, although you're no longer a part of that committee to create the standards, what can we do now, for example, to get rid of that benefits language? Yeah, is there anything that we can do as an organization, as individuals, for the things that we see wrong clearly in the standards?
Thank you for that question. The best thing that I can recommend is conversations with your elected officials, especially your state elected officials. I think that would be a good place to start, is actually like call them. Even better, like make an appointment to go and see them and talk with them and show them the standards. I do have my own kind of questions about how well people have read the standards. And that to me is my biggest kind of advocacy as I talk to different groups in the community and in the state is please read the standards, read them in their entirety, learn, like use them as a tool for enriching and learning yourself. Lobby in, the state house, especially because you're the Florida PTA. I know you guys have some point during the legislative session where you guys go and you meet with elected officials, bring it back up. Any opportunity that you get to share with the community, your concerns. Hey, like in the chat, one of the questions was, can we change the language to enslaved? And my argument was, we did write the standards to say enslaved people, and it was changed. That was outside of our control and after we released it. So that was somebody above us that made that change. So, and that's part of why my letter was the way that it was, is I'm like, I did want to go to the top. We can try to advocate as much as we can. We could try to go to the Florida educational board when they come down to South Florida, because they do have their meetings in different regions of Florida throughout the year. So when they're in your area, go and during the public comments, like make it a point, like, hey, I'd really like for you guys to change these standards and update them because they don't reflect current knowledge. They don't accurately describe certain phenomenon. We'd like to see Africa listed in the first standard, not enslavement. That was one of the things that I lost with, is I wanted to start with Africa. There are castles and rock-hewn churches and magnificent architecture aside from the pyramids throughout the continent. And we don't get to teach that to students because, oh, that's a world history standard, so we can just rely on that. I lost that one too. So, definitely do that and vote. We have a right to vote. Let's use our right to vote and vote. I hope that answers your question, Karen.
Yeah, I would echo by, getting involved. I mean, we're preaching to the choir, obviously, but I think encouraging our friends as much as they can, to get on some of these advisory, these local school advisory committees. I mean, it's been a wake-up call for me to be, on an advisory committee for a K-5 school. I joke with the principal of that school all the time. I was a terrible student in elementary. I hate to even admit it. I don't know what I'm doing, but it makes a difference. And especially when you have people who are bus drivers, cafeteria workers, people who are sustaining these schools being a part of that school community, it really can turn the tide. One of the questions by the Great Migration, the Great Migration is pivotal in the Deep South. And in Emancipation Betrayed, I talk about the Great Migration in Florida as really a freedom movement. It's a movement where African Americans in Florida, are going to railway stations, literally trying to escape Fort Lauderdale. They're trying to escape Gadsden County. They're trying to escape Jacksonville and move to places like Birmingham, where there's a lot of industrial opportunity, or Atlanta, or Western Pennsylvania. And the police are there. And the state of Florida positions people who will become the state patrol, will become the National Guard at railway stations to try to stop African Americans from leaving these towns. And so this is a freedom struggle. It's a labor struggle, and the Great Migration is one of the reasons. The last thing I'll mention, but it's one of the reasons that James Weldon Johnson returns to Florida, because he's talking to all of these Black Floridians who are ending up in Brooklyn, in the South Bronx. And he's asking them, well, why are you here? Like, what are you trying to do? Well, I'm trying to vote. I'm trying, for the first time in my life, I would like to participate. I would like to make a decent wage for my family. I like to be able to make ends meet. And I cannot do it in Daytona. I cannot do it in Gainesville. I cannot do it in Tampa, but I may have a shot in Queens. I may have a shot in the meatpacking district in Chicago. And as perilous as those moves are, and they are perilous, the Great Migration is one of those great dramas in all of American history. And the last thing I mentioned, Mr. Fernandez was saying, working with the state education system in Connecticut, when we rewrote those standards to create an African American, Latino, and Puerto Rican studies curriculum in Connecticut, yes, we start with the Americas, so-called, we used to call it pre-Columbian era, right? There were indigenous cultures all throughout the Americas. We start in Africa, the cultures, the politics, the rise of the metalworking in what was then known as the medieval period. And so it is possible to do these things and to not just start with the idea of enslavement, and really just never, never kind of giving up.
We have, if we have time, one more question in the chat, if we can address that. Dr. Nelson Goddard, come off mute.
Thank you. Dr. Ortiz addressed some of it, but I asked to what extent did African Americans from Florida participate in the Great Migration, and would you consider the migration of African Americans from North and Central Florida to Southeast Florida during the 1950s and 1960s to be its own wave or its own pathway in a Great Migration?
Certainly, and I think, Dr. N.D.B. Connolly at Johns Hopkins has done really excellent work. His book on kind of the later years of the system of American apartheid, but how African Americans in Central and South Florida are trying to break that down. And the thing about the African diaspora in the Americas is that Black people are always on the move looking for opportunities. It's in terms of the ideas that are traveling, in terms of the workers that are traveling. And the work of my dear colleague, Sharon Austin at the University of Florida, the impact of Afro-Caribbean communities as part of this broader kind of intellectual and labor circuit is decisive as well. And so it isn't just movement within the state, it's movement within the state. It was mentioned by one of my colleagues earlier, and we call it the saltwater route of the Underground Railroad from Florida, the Bahamas to Martinique, and then sometimes returning to Florida. So yeah, those are, yeah, I would agree with you.
If I can add as well, the story of Reuben Stacy, which I shared with you earlier, he left Thomasville, Georgia, because one of his family members was lynched in Thomasville. And so he actually migrated down to Fort Lauderdale because Fort Lauderdale was part of Florida Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward's big project to drain the Everglades and make the farmland available to everyone. And so as the Everglades were drained, opportunity kind of literally popped out of the ground. And so a lot of people started migrating, and a lot of the pioneers that settled, and I say pioneers, and I mean also African Americans and Caribbean people who were part of the pioneers in Broward, did come here for opportunity because there was so much opportunity. It was literally, we talk about the West and westward expansion as like the final frontier, but South Florida was part of that final frontier in the early 1900s. So there were opportunities here. The men who built the railroads were literally Black laborers. The people who cleared the pine trees in Broward County were Black laborers. The people that built the communities that we enjoy today in South Florida were, Black pioneers. So I do think that there is a lot of that migration story. And then we also see the push factors for like Rosewood. A lot of the Rosewood descendants that survived the Rosewood massacre came to South Florida. A lot of the Ocoee descendants. I actually taught a student who was a descendant of Rosewood. And I didn't learn that until later in the school year. I'm like, oh my goodness, like this is part of your story. And she talked to her grandfather who still remembered some of the family stories. So I do think that we do see that, especially down here in South Florida. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
I think we could go on and on. It's this discussion has opened so many new doors for exploration, but we will be able to share the presentations and the webinar from this evening on the Florida PTA website, as we mentioned. I'd like to thank each and every one of our presenters again, as well as to our listening and viewing audience. And Carolyn, I'm going to turn it over to you for our final farewell.
Thank you, Nancy. You've already shared my thoughts. What an amazing evening. I think we could go on for quite some time. Our presenters have shared so much information and so much good information about things that we as parents and community members can do to educate our young people and ourselves, because it starts with us. If we don't know our history, we certainly can't teach it to anyone else. So thank you, presenters, for sharing your knowledge and your time with us this evening. Thank you, attendees, for taking the time and the effort to learn a little bit more and hopefully share that knowledge. And Nancy, of course, thank you to you and those who helped you put this together. Our next and final session will be held on the 23rd of May. Please come back and join us for session 4. Bring someone with you. Knowledge that you get that you keep to yourself is useless. So thank you again for joining us, and have a lovely rest of the evening, everyone. See you on May 23rd. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.